Before I begin, I need to make something very clear. What you're about to hear is based entirely on the events as described by the Lutz family and the investigations of paranormal experts Ed and Lorraine Warren. Some consider it real, others call it a hoax. Whether you believe it or not, the story is terrifying. In November 1975, George and Kathy Lutz, along with their 3 children, moved into a large Dutch colonial home at 112 Ocean Avenue, Amityville, New York. At first glance, it looked like a dream home. Spacious rooms, a large green lawn, white exterior walls, a picket fence, and a welcoming staircase. But within just 28 days, that dream would turn into a nightmare. The day the Lutz family arrived, the sky was overcast, gray clouds stretching across the horizon. The wind whispered through the bare trees surrounding the Dutch colonial home at 112 Ocean Avenue. From the outside, the house looked perfect, a white exterior gleaming against the dim light, green shutters framing the windows, and a spacious lawn leading to a picket fence. It could have been a picture from a home magazine, the kind of house families dream of living in. George, the father, parked his car and stepped out, surveying the house. His heart swelled with excitement. Finally, after years of searching, he had found a home for his family. His 3 children ran ahead and exploring the hallways, their voices echoing through the large rooms. Kathy, the mother, carried the last of the boxes, imagining the memories they would create in this house. Everything seemed perfect. But as they crossed the threshold, a strange sensation swept over them, a heaviness in the air, as though the house itself was watching. George shrugged it off, blaming fatigue from the move. The children laughed, their shadows dancing on the walls as the late afternoon sun filtered through the windows. Yet, even as they unpacked, small oddities began to make themselves known. The first thing was a chill in the hallway that didn't dissipate, even with the heater on. It felt unnatural, as if the air itself had weight. Then came the noises. Doors creaking when no one was near, floors groaning under invisible footsteps. Kathy paused mid-step, sensing that she was being watched. The children, noticing nothing at first, continued to explore, but soon whispered to each other about seeing shadows flit across rooms. That night, when the house grew dark and silent, things became worse. Kathy lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, when she felt a pressure against her chest, heavy and suffocating. George, sleeping beside her, stirred and muttered, thinking it was just a bad dream. The children, meanwhile, huddled together, whispering that they could see figures standing in their rooms, watching them silently. The smell arrived next, a stench of sulfur, decaying eggs, and something far worse that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. Kathy gagged, rushing to open windows, but the odor persisted, a constant, choking presence. George tried to reassure her. It's an old house. It has smells. Don't let it get to you. Yet even he could feel the cold, the oppressive weight in the air, and a creeping dread that had no explanation. Over the following days, the minor incidents became more frequent. Doors slammed shut for no reason. Windows refused to stay closed. Footsteps echoed along empty hallways. The children began speaking in low, frightened tones about seeing dark shapes watching them from corners, just beyond the light. Even the dog would bark at empty corners, tail stiff, eyes wide. The family realized something was wrong. Not just unusual, but wrong. Like the house itself had a heartbeat, a consciousness, and a will of its own. By the end of the first week, everyone felt it. The house wasn't welcoming them. It was testing them. It was alive in a way that defied explanation, and whatever presence resided there was waiting to reveal itself in ways they could not yet imagine. By the second week in the house, the Lutz family's unease had grown into real fear. The minor oddities of the first days, creaking floors, cold spots, whispers, were now impossible to ignore. The house seemed to breathe, its walls stretching and sighing with every passing hour. Shadows moved independently of any light source. The family began to feel that they were not alone, that the house itself was observing them. It started with small things. Chairs in the kitchen would slide across the floor as if pushed by invisible hands. Doors would slam violently, sometimes rattling the entire house. Objects would disappear for hours and then reappear in places where no one had put them. George began noticing scratches on walls and furniture, thin red lines that hadn't been there the night before. Kathy would wake up to the smell of sulfur so strong she thought the house was on fire. The children were terrified. One morning, they told their mother they had seen a figure standing in the hallway, just beyond the light of their bedroom door. "It was tall, so tall," whispered their youngest, "and its eyes, they glowed red." Kathy tried to comfort them, assuring them it was a trick of the shadows, but deep down she felt the same fear that the children described. Every room of the house carried a heavy, suffocating energy. At night, the terror increased. George woke to find a green, slimy substance oozing from the walls of the living room. He rubbed his eyes, thinking it was a dream, but the substance remained, cold and pulsating like it had a life of its own. Kathy would wake screaming, feeling an invisible hand pressing on her chest, unable to move. The children whispered that they could hear voices chanting strange, guttural words, coming from the basement and attic. No matter how hard they tried, no one could find the source. One evening, George walked into the living room and noticed the furniture arranged differently from when he had left it. Chairs were overturned. The couch was pushed against the wall. And there, in the corner, was a shadow. A black shape, taller than any person, with no discernible features. It seemed to breathe, to watch him. He froze, unsure whether to approach or flee. At that moment, a window in the far corner slammed open violently, and the wind carried a low whisper. "Go." The children began refusing to sleep alone. "Mom, Dad, it's in the hallway again," they would say, trembling. Kathy tried to calm them, but her own nerves were fraying. She started having nightmares, waking in the middle of the night in a cold sweat. George attempted to rationalize everything, telling himself it was stress, imagination, the creaks of an old house. But the scratches on his arms each morning and the red, glowing handprints on the walls made rational explanations impossible. The activity was not limited to visual and tactile phenomena. The family reported hearing loud banging, as if someone were hammering from inside the walls. Footsteps echoed on staircases where no one was present. Whispers of conversations that made no sense at first became more distinct, calling out the family members' names, repeating phrases like, "Leave, leave now," in voices that chilled the blood. Kathy began to notice strange writings on walls that appeared overnight. Letters and symbols in red, black, and green, sometimes resembling inverted crosses, sometimes indecipherable. She would wake to see them freshly drawn, with no memory of anyone approaching the rooms. At one point, the children said the shadows themselves were speaking to them, moving closer, almost like they could feel the children's fear and feed on it. The oppressive atmosphere in the house became unbearable. Even mundane tasks felt dangerous. George would hesitate before walking down the hallways. Kathy avoided the basement entirely. The children clung to each other, terrified of the shadows that seemed to lurk everywhere. Their dog growled constantly, fur standing on end, even in rooms where no one could see it. Each night, the activity seemed to escalate further. Cold air would hit them even in closed rooms. Lights flickered, sometimes shutting off completely. Doors slammed open and shut in rhythm with what sounded like whispers in another language. The family was exhausted, mentally and physically drained. Every creak, every shadow, every strange smell heightened their fear. The house had become a prison of terror, and they realized that whatever resided within was not just observing them, it was testing them, tormenting them, feeding on their growing terror. The Lutz family began documenting what was happening, writing down every incident, every whisper, every shadow. They didn't know how long they could endure this escalating nightmare. Every day that passed, the house seemed to grow stronger, more alive, more insistent that they could not leave. The ordinary world outside seemed impossibly far away. Inside, only fear existed. And as the nights grew darker, the family realized they were in far deeper danger than they could have ever imagined. By the third week, the Lutz family could no longer endure the escalating terror alone. They had tried everything, ignoring it, rationalizing it, even attempting to leave for short periods. But the house seemed to follow them with its oppressive energy. Desperate, they reached out to Ed and Lorraine Warren, renowned paranormal investigators who had encountered some of the most infamous hauntings in history. When the Warrens arrived, they were immediately struck by the atmosphere. Even in broad daylight, the house seemed dark, heavy, and suffocating. Lorraine commented quietly, "I can feel it. There's something here. Something malevolent, intelligent, and angry." Ed nodded, scanning the rooms with a measured, careful gaze. They brought equipment, cameras, EVP recorders, and tools they believed could detect or repel spiritual entities. Their first walkthrough revealed strange markings on the walls and ceilings, some of which had appeared overnight. Lorraine paused in the living room, her hand hovering near a set of symbols in red that seemed to drip like fresh blood. She whispered, "These are not ordinary markings. Whoever or whatever did this wants us to see it, to feel fear." George shivered at her words, but there was no denying the ominous presence in the room. The Warrens began their investigation methodically. They set up cameras in hallways, bedrooms, and the basement. They placed EVP recorders near windows and doors where the family had reported hearing whispers. Lorraine performed blessings and prayers, while Ed carefully observed the reactions of both the family and the house itself. Within minutes, the activity began. Lights flickered violently in the hallway. A chair in the kitchen flew across the room, striking the wall with a loud crash. George rushed to the scene. "Enough! Leave us alone!" But there was no one there. Lorraine and Ed watched silently, taking notes and recordings, their expressions grave. The air was thick, almost solid, pressing down on everyone present. The children, who had been hiding in their rooms, watched wide-eyed as objects moved without cause. Lorraine knelt to speak to them gently, trying to calm their fear. "It's not your fault," she said. "Nothing you did made this happen." But the shadows in the corners of the rooms seemed to stretch, moving closer, almost as if aware of their words. One of the most chilling events occurred in George's bedroom. He woke suddenly to find himself levitating a few inches above the bed, his body rigid and immobile. The air around him was freezing, his breath visible in short clouds. Lorraine approached cautiously, holding her rosary, and began prayers. As George slowly floated back down, a low, guttural growl echoed through the walls, shaking the windows and making the floorboards tremble. The family screamed, terrified, but the Warrens remained calm, documenting everything. The investigation continued into the night. Strange voices were recorded on the EVP devices, speaking in languages no one could recognize. Furniture moved on its own. Doors slammed shut and then violently swung open, as though something unseen wanted to trap the family inside. Lorraine noted in her journal that the energy in the house was not chaotic, it was deliberate, intelligent, almost aware of their every move. The basement, in particular, was a hotspot of activity. George described a green, slimy substance that seemed to pulse along the walls, sometimes forming shapes that resembled faces screaming in torment. The children refused to enter the basement altogether. Ed attempted to take readings, but the instruments would fail intermittently, batteries draining mysteriously, lights flickering violently, and cameras malfunctioning. The house itself seemed to resist being observed. During one intense moment, red handprints appeared on the walls overnight, glowing faintly in the dim light. The family and Warrens watched, horrified, as the prints seemed to move slightly, as if shifting when no one was looking. Lorraine muttered, "It's feeding on their fear. It's feeding."
Whatever is here, it thrives on terror.
Even as the Warrens attempted blessings and prayers, the house seemed to react. The temperature dropped suddenly, cold enough that everyone's breath came out in puffs. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, creeping along floors and walls. Low whispers echoed from the attic, repeating the names of the family members over and over. Every creak, every gust of wind, every flicker of light intensified the feeling that the house was alive and aware. By the end of the first night, it was clear. This was not a normal haunting. Lorraine whispered to Ed, "It's intelligent. It knows we're here. It's testing us. And it's angry." George and Kathy realized that no normal family could survive another night here without help. The entity wasn't just haunting the house, it was claiming it, asserting power over everyone who dared enter. The Warrens continued to document every incident. They spoke to the family, reassuring them that the house itself was not invincible, but they warned, the presence was extraordinarily strong. Whatever resided within the walls was not a prank, not imagination, and not a spirit to be reasoned with. It was something darker, feeding off their fear, growing stronger each day. As dawn broke, the family sat exhausted, physically and emotionally drained. The house was silent for a moment, but the oppressive weight remained. The Warrens prepared for the next investigation session, knowing that each night would bring new horrors, each more intense than the last. And the family realized that their dream home had become a prison, with a presence they could neither see nor fight, but could only. By the fourth week, the Lutz family had reached the brink of terror. What began as small disturbances had escalated into an unrelenting nightmare. Every room in the house seemed alive, reacting to their presence. The walls creaked, shadows stretched unnaturally, and cold spots grew colder, freezing them in place, even in the warmth of their beds. It was no longer possible to sleep, eat, or relax. Fear had become a constant companion, pressing down on them day and night. One night, George woke to find a strange green light emanating from the hallway. He stepped cautiously toward it, only to see the shadowy figure standing near the staircase, taller and darker than any human. It moved silently, watching him with what seemed like glowing red eyes. George froze, unable to call for Kathy, unable to move. The presence was so heavy, so oppressive, that he felt it pressing down on his chest. He could hear whispers, faint at first, but growing louder. "Leave. Leave now." Kathy had been awake as well. She felt an invisible weight on her chest, something pushing her down into the mattress. The children huddled together in their rooms, trembling. Their whispers grew frantic. "Mom, Dad, it's in the hallway again." Kathy tried to reassure them, but her own terror made her voice tremble. She realized that the house was no longer just haunted. It was hunting them, testing their courage, feeding on their fear. The next day, George discovered fresh scratches across his arms, deep and painful, yet no one in the family had touched him. The walls bore new marks, strange red handprints, almost glowing in the dim light. Furniture had moved overnight, often blocking doors and stairways. The dog barked incessantly, growling at corners where no one stood. Even the air itself felt heavy, thick with an unspoken malice. The children spoke of shadows that moved closer every night, whispering unintelligible words and sometimes their own names. Their fear became palpable. One night, the youngest whispered to Kathy, "It's waiting for us. It's hungry." Kathy hugged him tightly, trying to suppress her own growing panic. George tried to stay calm, rationalizing the events, but even he could feel the pressure building in the air, as if something in the house was aware of every heartbeat, every thought, every fear. Objects began flying across rooms without warning. Chairs and lamps crashed to the floor. Doors slammed violently, sometimes shaking the entire house. One night, George woke screaming as an invisible force lifted him from the bed and held him in place. Kathy ran in, praying aloud, and the weight released him. But the terror lingered, etched in their minds, a constant reminder that the house was alive and dangerous. Even mundane spaces became sources of fear. The kitchen, where they once cooked together as a family, now seemed hostile. Cabinets opened by themselves. Food flew from shelves. Appliances turned on and off without cause. The basement had become forbidden territory, emanating a dark, pulsing energy. No one could step inside without feeling a cold, heavy presence pushing them back. Every creak of the stairs, every flicker of the lights, every whisper carried the message, "You do not belong here." The family began to pack in haste, leaving most of their belongings behind. Each step toward the front door felt as if the house itself resisted them. The walls seemed to pulse, the floors trembled, and shadows followed them, stretching across the rooms, reaching, watching. The children clung to their parents, and trembling. George shouted, "We're leaving! Get to the car!" But even the hallway seemed to stretch, as if the house was holding them in place. At the climax of that final night, every part of the house erupted in chaos. Objects flew, lights flashed, shadows writhed across the walls, and low, guttural whispers filled the air, repeating names, mocking them, warning them. It was as if the house itself had come alive, demanding obedience, refusing to let them go. The family huddled together in the living room, hearts pounding, knowing they had no choice but to flee immediately. At dawn, after 28 torturous days, the Lutz family finally escaped. They ran out of the house, leaving behind everything that had once made it a home. The air outside felt lighter, warmer, normal. But even as they drove away, they could not shake the feeling that the house was still watching, still waiting, and that some part of it had followed them, invisible and patient, lying in wait for the next family to enter its walls. That house, 112 Ocean Avenue, had become more than haunted. It had become a prison, a predator, a force that thrived on fear. And the Lutz family learned the hard truth. Some houses are not just buildings, they are living nightmares. When the police left that night, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the spot where Mr. Harrow had stood only hours earlier. The room felt colder now, emptier, as if something had been waiting for all of us to leave so it could finally breathe again. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the narrow gap beneath the front door. It almost sounded like someone quietly sighing. The sound grew louder, dragging against the walls, fluttering the edges of papers on the table like invisible fingers brushing past them. I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself it was just the wind, just the house settling. But the house was too new for settling, and the wind didn't know my name. At exactly 3:17 a.m., every light in the house flickered. Not the quick mechanical blink of electricity. This was slower, like something was inhaling deeply through the wiring, pulling the light inward, starving the rooms of illumination. And then, everything went black. I reached for my phone, but before the screen lit up, I heard it. A soft knocking. Not on the door, inside the walls. 3 knocks, slow, measured, as if whoever or whatever was behind the plaster knew I was listening. I didn't move. My muscles locked, breath trapped behind a rising edge of fear. Then the knocks came again, this time closer. I backed away, bumping into the cabinet. The phone slipped from my hand and hit the floor, echoing louder than it should have in the darkness. When I finally picked it up, the screen glowed just enough to illuminate the hallway, and that's when I saw it. A shadow. Not cast by anything, not shaped like anything human. It stretched across the floor, long and thin, as if someone was standing out of sight, but the angle was all wrong. The shadow moved slightly, like it was breathing, pulsing with a faint rhythm that didn't match my heartbeat. Then my phone buzzed. A voicemail. Unknown number. I pressed play. At first, only static, coarse, heavy, like fabric dragged across a microphone. Then the noise sharpened, shifted, and formed a whispering voice. My voice. Whispering words I had written in the journal earlier, words I had never spoken out loud. The whispering stopped, replaced by a deep exhale, as if someone leaned too close to the phone. And just before the recording ended, a final sound slipped through. 3 knocks, exactly the same as the ones inside the walls. My throat tightened. The air thickened. I turned toward the hallway, and that's when the shadow began to rise. Not up the wall, off the floor, unfolding into a shape that shouldn't exist, limbs too long, a head angled wrong, movements glitching like corrupted video frames. I ran. Not for the door, for the kitchen, where I'd seen the flashlight earlier. My hands fumbled through drawers, breath harsh and uneven. Behind me, the shadow crept closer, dragging itself across the wood. I found the flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness and froze on the figure at the end of the hallway. For 1 second, the light revealed a face. Human, but wrong. Eyes too wide, stretched in terror. A mouth open in a silent scream. Skin pale and tight as if starved of sunlight. And I recognized it. Not because I'd seen it before, but because I had drawn it hours earlier in the journal. What I thought were random scribbles now formed the portrait of the thing standing in my house. The figure twitched violently, bones cracking at sharp angles, and then it lunged. The flashlight sputtered. The lights snapped back on. The hallway was empty, but the journal was now open on the floor. On the page with the face, new words were scratched below the drawing. Not alone. Not anymore. I stared, barely breathing. Then the knocks came again, this time from behind me. When the last night in that house finally arrived, the tension inside the walls felt like it was stretching to the point of snapping, as if every moment of fear the Lutz family had endured was building towards something unavoidable. The air grew thicker with each passing hour, pressing against their skin, making it hard to breathe, as though the house wanted them to feel its weight one final time before it let them go. George barely slept anymore, waking at the same hour every night, the cold pulling him out of bed like a command he couldn't ignore. Kathy's dreams had become so vivid that she woke trembling, convinced she had seen the face of a woman who once lived in the house, staring straight into her own. The children were no longer themselves, restless, pale, their moods changing without warning, as if something unseen whispered to them in the dark when no one was watching. That night, the temperature dropped so suddenly that their breath fogged in front of them, swirling unnaturally fast, disappearing before it should have. Something thumped in the hallway, slow, intentional, like heavy footsteps pacing the floor, deciding where to go next. The lights flickered, humming loudly, as if the electricity strained under a presence too strong for the house to contain. Doors slammed without reason. A foul smell drifted through the rooms, thick and hard to place, the kind of odor that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Then the sounds began, soft at first, then rising, overlapping, voices they couldn't quite understand, as though several conversations were happening at once behind the walls. George heard his name whispered more clearly than ever before, so close it felt like breath on the back of his neck. Something invisible pulled at his arm as he stepped backward, tightening around him with cold determination. In the children's room, a window slammed open with such force that the frame cracked, the wind rushing in with a shriek that wasn't entirely the wind. Kathy grabbed the children as George shouted for them to get downstairs. The house seemed to resist their movement, every step feeling heavier, like wading through deep water. The staircase groaned violently beneath their feet, as though it wanted to split apart. The front door, which always stuck and jammed no matter how hard George pulled, flew open on its own, slamming against the wall with a force that shook the pictures free from their hooks. For one moment, just before stepping outside, Kathy turned back, and she later swore she saw a dark shape standing at the top of the staircase, tall, still, outlined against the faint glow of the hall light. It didn't move. It didn't chase. It only watched. They ran into the freezing night air, leaving everything behind except each other. The door slammed shut behind them, as if the house itself exhaled. When they reached safety hours later, George realized he hadn't taken a single thing. Not a coat, not a wallet, not a key. They never went back for their belongings. They never spent another night in that house. The investigation that followed, priests, reporters, researchers, skeptics, believers, brought questions and arguments that still continue today. But the Lutz family never changed their story. To their final day, they said every moment in that house happened exactly as they told it, and that the evil inside it never needed them to believe in it. It only needed them to stay.